Hey everyone. In this section, we're going to talk about the anatomy of the brain. So, our nervous system is broken up into two major divisions: the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is your brain and your spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system is anything that's not your brain or spinal cord. When we're looking at the central nervous system, we look at the spinal cord and then the brain. The brain has three main divisions to it: the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the forebrain. So let's start with the hindbrain. As we're moving off of the spinal cord and we're moving up toward the brain, the hindbrain then is the first thing you run into. And if you're looking at it, you kind of have two bumps. The first bump is the medulla. The medulla controls survival functions, things like your heart rate and your breathing. In general, this is what you find in the organization of the brain. Things closest to the spinal cord are most responsible for the very basic things of just keeping us alive. And as we move through the brain out to the outer parts, the wrinkly parts of the brain, we move toward things that are kind of higher functioning things, all the way to the outer cortex, which is going to be where our higher order thinking and language and things like that occur. So let's go back to the hindbrain. Coming off the spinal cord, we first have the medulla, which is really important for things like heart rate and breathing. We then see the pons. The pons regulate sleep and arousal, coordinates movement of the right and left sides of your body. Off to the back, there you have the cerebellum, it's called the little brain because it's a very distinct looking part of the brain. And this is really important for the coordination of movement and balance. Now, moving up from the hindbrain, we have the midbrain. The midbrain is a little harder to study because all of its structures are kind of internal rather than having bumps that you can kind of easily identify. So there's a lot of structures inside the midbrain, but we won't go through all of them. And so some important ones include the substantia nigra. This is really important for the initiation of voluntary motor activity. A person who has Parkinson's disease, this is the area of the brain that actually where the neurons start dying. Periaqueductal gray is another region in the midbrain that's very important for pain regulation. You also have the reticular formation, which actually spans the midbrain and the hindbrain. And it has a lot of functions like regulating sleep and wakefulness. It modulates muscle reflexes. It modulates breathing and pain perception as well. So as we move up through the brain, we then get to the forebrain. And there's kind of two areas of the forebrain. When we think of a brain, you think of that wrinkly outer side that you can kind of see, but there is subcortical structures inside of that. And that's what we're going to talk about first. So one of these areas is the thalamus. So the thalamus is really important because almost all your sensory information first comes into the thalamus, where then is then sent to other parts of the brain in order to then to make sense of that sensory information. Your hypothalamus sits right below your thalamus, And it's really important because it regulates bodily functions, mainly through interactions with hormones. Your pituitary gland, that master gland, is attached to the hypothalamus. So it sends a lot of its signaling through that mechanism to regulate hormones, which then regulate function throughout your body. Another really important structure here is the hippocampus. The hippocampus is associated with the formation of memories. A person who has damage to the hippocampus has trouble forming new memories. Hippocampus is also responsible for spatial memory, your ability to have kind of a map in your head. Another important structure is the amygdala. The amygdala processes emotional significance of stimuli, especially fear. Also, has a role of enhancing memories when we have periods of extreme emotional arousal. So sometimes people in can remember large amounts of details about something that was a particularly scary or otherwise emotional experience, and the amygdala plays a role in that. Now, as we move out in the brain to the forebrain or to the outer cortical areas, um, then we can see that the cortex we divide into four main regions. Also, there is a left and a right side of the brain as well. And so these two hemispheres that we call them are connected by the corpus callosum, which is this massive bridge of axons that are communicating from the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere of the brain. The lobes of the cortex are the frontal, the parietal, the temporal, and the occipital. So the frontal lobe of the brain is in the front. We do a lot of our very complex cognitive processes here, rational thought, paying attention, planning. We also see behavioral inhibition here. These parts of the brain don't necessarily act alone. For example, I said earlier that the amygdala was responsible for fear processing. Well, this is where the frontal lobe can actually interact. Let's say, for instance, that a person sees something that is potentially fearful. The amygdala's job is to raise a red flag and go, hey, there's something here that maybe you need to pay attention to. Your frontal cortex then would receive that information, and then it has to make the decisions. Is this something I need to react to, or is this nothing? And so it can do predictive thought. It can say, oh, we heard a funny noise, but this isn't the type situation where I should have to worry about things. And so I'm not going to worry about whatever that weird noise was that the amygdala alerted us to. Or your frontal cortex would say, oh, well, this is actually in a situation that I don't have a lot of control over. That really could be something I need to worry about. Maybe we need to run away or call for help or something. So your frontal cortex interacts with your amygdala and then can make decisions about what you need to do in response to a fearful stimuli. Also, in the frontal cortex is what we call the motor cortex, which we mentioned earlier. And so the very back of the frontal cortex that kind of borders the parietal lobe then is really important for motor movement. As we move back on the brain, we have that parietal lobe. And so this is the kind of the top middle of the brain. And just like we have a way to have motor output, we also have a map of our body that responds to touch. And this is in the parietal lobe, the areas that border there with the frontal lobe. So just like we have areas that create specific movements, we also have specific areas of the brain that match up with parts of the body to determine touch. We also see visuospatial processing occur in the parietal lobe as well. So when we're talking about the what we call the somatosensory, this is the area that processes touch, and the motor cortex, we often talk about the homunculus. And as I said, there are parts of the brain. Your right finger. There is some part of your brain on the left hand side of the brain that specifically corresponds with your right finger. That if you want to wiggle it, that it wiggles, and that is a different part of the brain that moves your toes or your elbow or what have you. Or and then you also have that on the touch. If I touch something with my right finger, then on the left hand side there is a specific part of the brain that is responsible for processing that touch, and that is different than touching my face or touching my knee. That there are different parts, and so we have what we call these homunculus, which is the idea that if your body was the size of the amount of neural tissue associated with it. So there's lots of tissue of brain space that is associated with things like your lips and your mouth and your face and your fingers. On the other hand, there's not a lot of neural tissue that is devoted to, say, your torso or your back, because those aren't very sensitive to touch. And on the movement side, there's not a lot of movements. It isn't the fine motor movements that you would do with your fingers, or think about your mouth. When I'm talking right now, I have all these motor fine motor movements that I'm having to make in order to make speech happen. And so there's lots of brain tissue that is devoted to these areas, whereas areas where I don't have a lot of sensitivity or don't do a lot of motion, there's then less brain tissue associated with it. The other two lobes of the cortex, one, we have the temporal lobe. And so they're located on the side of the brains by your temples, and they're important for processing auditory information and also perceiving objects and faces. If you've ever noticed how when you look at an inanimate object and it's something that might look like a face, and that's because we have a specific area of the brain and the temporal lobe that is designed to recognize faces. And then the remaining lobe of the cortex is the occipital lobe. This is in the very back of the brain, and this is very important for visual processing.